Good evening, and welcome to the first event in this year's annual Holocaust Memorial Week. My name is Kara Ritzheimer. I'm an associate professor of European history at Oregon State University, and I've been a member of the Holocaust Memorial Week Committee for 15 years. It is my distinct pleasure to welcome you to this evening's event and introduce our first speaker. But before I do, I'd like to share a little information with you. This year marks the 34th annual Holocaust Memorial Week at Oregon State University. The program is actually 35 years old, but when COVID hit in 2020, we had to cancel all of our scheduled in-person events. By 2021, we were able to organize a week of virtual events, and I'm sure many of you attended those talks. Now that we're all accustomed to Zoom and hybrid, this year's commemoration includes a mix of virtual and in-person events. Please check out our poster for this year's commemoration, and there's a link in the chat that goes to our website, which if you scroll down, will have the poster. And you'll see that there are hyperlinks under each event, so you can use those to log into Zoom. I'd also like to explain that our annual commemoration corresponds with Holocaust Remembrance Day, which in turn corresponds to the anniversary of the 1943 Warsaw Ghetto Uprising in the Hebrew calendar. And for the past 34 years, the committee that organizes this event has done an amazing job of giving OSU and Corvallis audiences opportunities to learn more about the research and scholarship of top-notch scholars who study the Holocaust and other genocides, as well as hear the voices and stories of Holocaust survivors. So just to phrase this in another way, over the past 35 years, this event has brought more than 34 Holocaust survivors to OSU, as well as an impressive array of scholars doing pioneering work. And our speaker tonight very much fits into this tradition. Thankfully, you can find recordings of many of our past speakers at our webpage, holocaust.oregonstate.edu. If you are an educator or student or someone who wants to expand their knowledge about the Holocaust and other genocides, I strongly encourage you to visit our website. There is also a donate button if you'd like to support our programming. I would also like to take a moment to acknowledge the essential work that my colleague, Dr. Paul Kopperman, has done to sustain and shepherd this program throughout its existence. Dr. Kopperman has been a member of this committee since it was first created in January 1987, and he has chaired it for nearly 3 decades. His tireless commitment to Holocaust education and offering audiences a full week of events has helped to make Oregon State University a leader in Holocaust education. There is no doubt in my mind that his leadership and commitment have made all the difference in making our Holocaust Memorial Week an excellent program and one of the longest running programs in America. And now it is my great pleasure to introduce our speaker this evening, Dr. Edward B. Westerman. Dr. Westerman received his PhD from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill and is a Regents Professor of History at Texas A&M University, San Antonio. He has published extensively in the areas of the Holocaust, genocide, and German military history, and is the author of 4 books and 2 edited volumes, including Hitler's Police Battalions, Enforcing Racial War in the East, and Hitler's Ostkrieg and the Indian Wars, Comparing Genocide and Conquest. He is also a distinguished researcher. He was a Fulbright Fellow in Berlin, a 3-time German Academic Exchange Service Fellow, and a J.B. and Maurice Shapiro Fellow at the U.S. Holocaust Museum. His most recent work, Drunk on Genocide, Alcohol and Mass Murder in Nazi Germany, appeared with Cornell University Press in association with the U.S. Holocaust Museum in March of 2021. His talk tonight, titled How Masculinity and Alcohol Fed Mass Murder, is based on this research. Before I turn things over, I would like to clarify that Dr. Westerman will speak for about 40 to 45 minutes, and then we will have time for questions afterward. Please submit your questions using the Q&A button on the bottom of your screen. The questions won't be publicly visible, but I will be able to see them, and then I will collect these questions and pose them to Dr. Westerman. And with that, I will now pass things on to Dr. Westerman, who is joining us from Texas, where it is now after 9 p.m.
Well, thank you so much, Kara. I want to thank also Oregon State, the College of Arts and Sciences, and everyone that's behind the scenes, Aaron and Luke, helping us to put this together. And I'd like to also thank all the people who have taken time to hear this presentation. I have a little bit of a cold going on here, so hopefully my voice is going to hold up for you. But looking at this topic, talking about alcohol, what I've got here in the first slide, as you see, is something that's really not extraordinary. In fact, it's very ordinary. This is a police battalion 101, They've been stationed in the Łódź ghetto in Poland. It's Christmas of 1940, and they're sitting around drinking beer and celebrating. So again, something that would not seem at all in this case extraordinary. But if we add, and if my slide builds, we'll tell you what, I'm having trouble with my share. So let me stop the share. Let me go back and re-enter it, and we'll take a look. Okay, so let's see if this works. So there we go. So as you see, I've added another photo here, and this is actually a skit that was performed at that Christmas celebration. And in that skit, you see three of the policemen, and they've dressed one of their policemen, one of their colleagues, as a Jew, and they put a basket in his hand, and as you can see, they're smiling. They've interdicted this smuggler. Now, what you would need to know is for the past month, unit has been making liberal use of their weapons in guarding the Łódź ghetto and have killed a number of people for smuggling. So thinking about the integration of a skit that celebrates your actions of murder in your Christmas festival, I think gives us a different idea about the nature of that kind of gathering. And as I was started out looking at this topic, the first question I really had was what role did alcohol in drinking ritual play among the perpetrators? So how did they use alcohol? But what was really clear to me very soon thereafter, it's not just a question of literal intoxication of drinking, but perhaps even more importantly, this concept of metaphorical intoxication, the control over the land and bodies of others, especially in the East and especially in concentration camps and killing centers. And then as I was developing this topic, it was also clear that the SS and the police and these German paramilitaries had a very distinct sense of masculinity, what I described as hyper masculinity, masculinity that includes elements of this militarized masculinity, of toughness and hardness, but also performative masculinity. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. And then the thing that I started with that second photo, what was really striking to me is the ways in which alcohol and celebratory ritual were used by the perpetrators as I continue to look at this. Now, in thinking about alcohol, the roles and functions of alcohol, this list really wouldn't be surprising to most people. Social bonding and celebration. So, in this case, getting together to celebrate a birthday, a promotion, a win for your team in the Super Bowl, your football team, whatever the case might be. However, that there are also rituals of drinking that include what's actually being consumed and how it's being consumed. When I talk to my students about competitions, for example, in drinking, we talk about this idea of beer pong, for example, in colleges, the way in which drinking and not showing the effects of drinking, but also your skill in this game are a marker of your capability. And again, it should be no surprise from just reading the newspaper from the college environment that we're so familiar with, that alcohol, masculinity, and physical and sexual violence intersect. And we've seen that in many cases, especially when we look at stories on fraternities and the way that these come together. Selective disinhibition is what I tell my students. This is what I call the spring break effect. And what I mean by that is it's doing something you normally wouldn't have done. So when you got to your spring break hotel and you went out on the third floor balcony that overlooked the pool at 9 in the morning, you weren't thinking about jumping from that balcony into the pool. However, 9 o'clock that night, after a day of drinking and maybe a dare questioning your toughness, then you are willing to do that. So we see the way in which disinhibition happens. And in the case of Nazi perpetrators, where we see disinhibition was often with the killing of women or children, that drinking was a way for individuals to cross that threshold. And the next one is really, for me, a very interesting and perhaps one of the most important findings of the work, the idea of facilitation, the idea that drinking and celebratory ritual leads to more acts of killing. And I have some examples that we'll look at. And finally, the last two in this list, if you're familiar with Chris Browning's Ordinary Men and Police Battalion 101, he talks about how alcohol is an incentive and reward for men. And he also talks about the way in which the perpetrators, after being involved in these killing actions, used alcohol as a coping mechanism for what they've been involved with. And that's something I'm going to complicate as we kind of move forward and look at this. This just gives you an idea of the various chapters from the work itself. And if you're looking at rituals of humiliation, for example, these are rituals that might be cutting off half the beard of a Jewish man, cutting off earlocks. They might be having individuals have to clean out a septic tank or cesspool with their hands, or clean the streets with their underwear, these types of things. And it's not necessarily something that requires alcohol. However, I think this is again where we start to see that metaphorical intoxication that starts to take over the control of an individual over others. And as we look at this, Omer Bartov in his in his book that looks at the community of Buchach talks about how the removal of the Jews as workaday, as workday entertainment is the term he used, is something that's not normally described in the literature. And in fact, one of the things that I'll talk about is there's a great deal of witness and bystander and victim testimony that talks about entertainment, the entertainment of the perpetrators in these acts. And that's something that I want to focus on, this kind of celebratory ritual. Now, as a historian, one of the things that's really important for me to mention here is that this doesn't start fully formed in January of 1933 when Hitler comes to power. In fact, these rituals, these conceptions of masculinity, they are already being formed before Hitler comes to power in the 1920s and early 1930s, and they're being performed within by the stormtroopers. And one of the things that you would need to understand is that political parties and political paramilitary groups under Weimar have their own pubs or restaurant bar areas. And so they gather there as sites of political mobilization. And drinking ritual takes place there, military drill, military reading of orders, the building of this idea of camaraderie, performative masculinity, which includes things like your ability to outdrink another man without losing kind of your ability to function, or the ability to use your fists better than your peers, is also part of that. One of the most interesting things for me in doing this topic was the role of song and music and the integration of song that includes things like the words, but also that includes the volume, the verbal ferocity of song and music that's integrated into these spaces. And then finally, these spaces are way stations in which normally at the end of the evening, this is when these groups go out and they look for their opponents. In the case of the stormtroopers, looking for communists or socialists and going into those neighborhoods to fight, if you will. The other thing I would note about these SA pubs is they're essentially male-only spaces. So when women are allowed into these spaces, and that happens on some rare occasions, they're not allowed to drink alcohol. They can have soda or they can have water. But again, we start to see this kind of gender differentiation of the space and expectations themselves. The quote that you're seeing here is from the diary of Abraham Plutkin, who was a US labor organizer. And he and others talk about how important the idea of music was to these Nazi paramilitaries, and in fact to the Hitler Youth as well. There's even the expression the Singerdiktatur, or dictatorship of song, and I think sometimes we don't necessarily think about how important song and music it is to kind of building that kind of camaraderie. But where we also see it is in witnesses, in the case of Jewish witnesses who remember SA troops marching down with these bands and the songs that they're singing and the kind of, if you will, oral threat that they're feeling just due to the nature of the sound and the songs itself. In the case of looking at before the war starts, where do we also see these sites, these zones of exception, as Donald Bloxham has talked about? And those are in the concentration camps in Germany themselves. So rituals of humiliation take place. And it's not just during the day. For example, in the camps, there are SS canteens. These are bars and restaurants for the SS guards. And they go there at the end of the day. But what you'll see in the testimony often is how those sites, at the end of the day, the SS is relaxing, it's nighttime, they're drinking, they're singing, they're eating, and then they'll bring in prisoners to literally play with them or humiliate them. Or they'll go into the barracks to go ahead and beat or abuse prisoners. And we see this violence as amusement. And I want to really underline this idea, the way in which many witnesses use the term, that the perpetrators were amusing themselves, they were entertaining themselves, they were having fun, they were laughing. And I think that looking at the terms that the witnesses use give us a really good perspective for thinking about what the victims were experiencing. And these ideas of competition. So in the camps itself, you have SS men competing against other SS men who can deliver a better beating. You have these tropes of guards naming themselves the boxer. And in the case of the boxer, his skill is to be able to knock out a prisoner with one blow. And he tries to demonstrate that over and over. And there's not just one person who's the boxer. We see this kind of pattern in the concentration camps and others. The idea of playing games with prisoners and murder games. One of the most clear ones is taking the prisoner's hat, throwing it away, and then telling the prisoner to go pick up the hat, at which time the guard shoots them and the prisoner is killed, quote, shot while trying to escape. So we see in the way in which this kind of entertainment takes place. And even Rudolf Höss, who was the head of the concentration camp at Auschwitz, the concentration and death camp at Auschwitz, Höss in his death row memoir himself remarks on how SS guards at Auschwitz saw the flogging of prisoners as a spectacle and a kind of entertainment. So even from the perpetrator's perspective, we see the enjoyment that's taken in some of these actions. And the integration again of music. On the left, you see the SS canteen at the killing center of Sobibor. And those are some of the SS guards gathered around playing the violin, playing the accordion. There's also prisoner orchestras, as in the case of the prisoner orchestra at Auschwitz that plays for the SS. But if you look at the primary source that's above this, Rudolf Rader is talking about Belzec, the killing center there. And he talks about how these murderers were in fact enjoying their Sunday and eating and drinking, and music is being played. And they're throwing the scraps to the prisoners, to the orchestra, just like you would do to an animal. But the other thing you have to imagine is that in this picture of Sobibor, just like at Belzec, the actual killing area is a couple hundred meters away from these sites. So these sites of enjoyment are embedded in the camp. And oftentimes, when we look at testimony, one of the things that's talked about is the smell at these areas, how people knew what was going on. So you see how the perpetrators themselves are staging these areas. Now, this is an example of what I call facilitation. And this is from a woman who remembered how these SS men came into the ghetto. And she describes this killing spree that they went on. And as you notice, she talks about they killed lots of people, in her term, as a sport, as a kind of game. But what's even more important to me in this case is if we look at when this happened. So this is New Year's Eve. And so what's been happening is, in fact, that these SS men have been celebrating, like many of us would do, bringing in the new year. And what's the first thing that they want to do to start off the new year? And that's to go into the ghetto and kill Jews, what they've been doing over the course of the year. And this facilitation, this idea of killing as a sport and continuing to do that. This is a case again where these individuals, I can't look into their minds, but I can see their behaviors, and this gives me an idea of their motivation. This is also really for me a very interesting slide because it depicts the police bar that was outside the Warsaw Ghetto for Police Battalion 61. And many of you looking at the slide on the picture on the left, the photo on the left, you're probably struck by the fact that there's a Star of David as a light fixture that's been included in their bar, a very cynical type of representation by these men. And if we were standing at that bar and I were to turn around to look at the tables, what you would notice is that the walls had these self-drawn murals, and these were drawn by the policemen themselves. And it shows their duty in guarding the Warsaw Ghetto. And in fact, one of them shows a Jewish man reaching down to pick up a potato while a German policeman levels his rifle and is getting ready to shoot him. And even before we got into this bar, as we approached the door to go in, we would have been struck by the fact that there were notches in that door, notches in groups of 5. And eventually there'll be 500 notches in that door. And each one of those represented a kill by this police battalion. So these men are celebrating their numbers. They go into the bar to sing, relax, and drink. In many cases, boast or brag about who's the better man, who's done more in this case. And just the idea of the ambiance of creating this type of situation, I think gives you an idea of what I'm talking about, the ritual itself and celebration. And in addition, when we look at some of the wording that's used by both perpetrators and witnesses talking about SS murder orgies that grew into real parties, and I put in the German word there, Festa, because it schnapps poured in rivers and loudspeakers played music over the screams of the victims. When you read that and when you understand that somebody is interpreting, for example, what they're seeing as a party on the part of what the SS is doing, I think it really starts to put it into a framework for understanding how the witnesses themselves are feeling and how the victims are feeling. And in fact, what's known as Horbansprach, the Yiddish language of destruction, in many cases, the use of the term wedding metaphor is used when the witnesses are watching the killing actions at the killing sites. And if we think about what these small shtetls, these tradespeople, these peasants, if you will, what would be the single most joyous day in their experience? Well, it would be a wedding. There'd be lots of music, there would be food to eat, there would be alcohol to drink. It would be a joyous occasion. So it's striking that those who are seeing what the Germans are doing are looking for a vocabulary to express what they're seeing. And they're drawing on their own vocabulary of this idea of a wedding metaphor. That's how they're seeing the perpetrators act in that case. And we again see this integration of music at these sites. Another thing where we see masculinity and ideas of gender integrated is with not only song and drinking, but eating at some of these sites, and allowing women to be present, in fact, at some of these sites. And this is the case of where the males are performing for these women. And I would also note that when we think about setting up a banquet site 15 or 20 meters away from a killing site with food on the table, alcohol there, what you have to imagine is that these men are at the killing pit. They're killing close and personal. In other words, they're being spattered with the blood and body matter of their victims. And what are they doing? They're then transitioning to a table, sitting down and eating a sandwich and drinking, and then going back to the pit. Now, one of the things that, again, when we think about thick description of these events, that many of the perpetrators and witnesses talk about the horrible smell at these killing sites, because blood, and some people use the term murder, has its own horrific smell. And if you've watched the act of killing about the murder of Indonesian communists, there's a scene where the main perpetrator talks about how when he was doing his technique for strangling individuals on this patio, and he's demonstrating it for the film crew. He said he had to change it because the smell was so terrible with so much blood. So I ask you to think about, what does that mean to overcome a physiological barrier of being at that site, witnessing what you're doing, and having that smell in your nose, and then going and sitting down. I think, again, it's these kinds of thick description that really give us an insight into the ways in which murder has been normalized amongst these men. And I have another example where a policeman comes back from a killing action, and there's a German secretary who he likes. And instead of going and taking a shower before he goes and sees her, he's covered with the blood and body matter of his victims. He decides to go see her first. And his expectation is that she'll see how tough and how hard a man he is. Now, I don't know what her reaction was, but the idea that he believed that that would impress her, I think, tells me something about that individual. And here again, I have some more examples of the way in which carousing, if you will see, these banquets, this eating and music. And this again starts to set a different type of scenario from men who've been involved in murder and go back to the bar and put their head down on the table and drink themselves senseless. We start to see, in fact, that the words used and the actions taken really give us a different idea about the behavior. And in the quote on the bottom, I've put in the German word because this is a policeman remembering. He described the Jews being led away. It was like a Volksfest, literally a carnival. In that kind of carnival environment, I think is really telling in the way that he's searching for a word to describe what he's witnessing. To me, one of the other things when we talk about performative masculinity is this idea of besting the other man. And here we have policemen talking that kept track of their numbers killed. In some cases, they put their notches in their foot lockers. They kept their scores, if you will. And the second vignette here is one that really struck me when I was doing the research, because it's a German administrator after the war. He's going to be interrogated, and he remembers in Poland going to the local German house. So that would have been a restaurant, bar, recreation area for German nationals in Poland. And before he gets in, he hears this singing. He hears this loud celebration going on. And then as he opens the door to go in, he sees an SS guy coming out. And what he immediately notices about the SS man is that he's got a beer coaster and the number 1000 in red, and it's pinned to his tunic, his uniform tunic. And when he asks the man what he's doing, he says, "Man, today I'm celebrating my 1000th killing," literally Knickschuss, which would be a shot in the back of the neck. And so this idea of celebrating whole numbers, again, the way in which celebratory rituals incorporated. We also see this in the so-called euthanasia program, or the T4 program, where individuals, SS men, who are the so-called burners, keep track of the number of bodies they've burned. And in this case, a celebration of 20,000 corpses is a special celebration. We see the very same thing with the liquidation of the Warsaw Ghetto in the summer and fall of 1942. So the majority of Jews that are sent from the Warsaw Ghetto are sent to Treblinka. And at Treblinka, they're keeping count. And when they hit the number 100,000, it's time for a special party, special alcohol ration that evening. And so again, the integration, if you will, of this kind of ritual into these actions is what we see. And Sobibor is another case I've talked about before, the killing center here. In this case, this is testimony from a Polish woman. And what you would need to know is that Sobibor is just a normal train stop. It's right next to the camp as well. And so there are commercial trains that move through Sobibor. And in this case, this Polish woman wants to get some cigarettes. And she hears celebration and music behind a door in a room at the Sobibor train station. So what she does is she opens that door, and here she describes what she sees. These tables covered with unbelievable number of alcohol bottles with foreign labels and excess food. And immediately, as a historian, I know where those bottles have come from. I know where that food's come from. It's been taken from those who've been deported and those who have been killed. At the table sat men, these SS men wearing these German uniforms. And she says, in a clearly drunken state, they amused themselves and told stories about their families. And again, her is amusement. And she also remembers that there's this large man playing the balalaika, this stringed instrument. And what strikes her about the individual is the fact that he has this very valuable ring on his finger. And a couple of years ago, there was an Israeli, Dutch, and Polish team that actually did some excavation at Sobibor, the actual ramp. And these are some of the artifacts they found. And when I saw this presentation, and I had already this testimony, if you look at that ring, it's not necessarily the ring the guy was wearing, but it gives you an idea of the way in which the artifacts of those who are being murdered are also being incorporated by the perpetrators into their own lives and their own lifestyle. And finally, this is another example in the camps where we see Johann Kremer, who is a SS doctor. He's describing participating in his diary. He's describing participating in his 12th and 13th Sonderaktion, which was actually mass gassings. And it's only about a three-line diary entry. And so he describes that, and then he transitions to talking about a cozy evening company that included Bulgarian red wine and Croatian brandy. This idea of witnessing the murders of thousands and talking about that to lead your entry, and then transitioning immediately to, yeah, I had a good evening as well. And when we see some of these pictures, this is a picture of a Wehrmacht, a German army unit in the East, and they're celebrating Christmas. And if we look at how some Soviets, in this case, Ilya Ehrenberg, the journalist and propagandist, he talks about how in our towns they are violating women and hanging men, they are guzzling alcohol and sleeping off their orgies like swine. And some might argue, well, that's Soviet propaganda. However, if we also look at letters from German soldiers home from the East, in this case, the way it's hoarded and guzzled here is incredible. And this picture, to me, really represents several things. These are two SS men. It's probably about 1943, the Cherkasy pocket, and they're drinking and they're guzzling, actually. It's probably a drinking game to see who finishes first. But what you can't probably see is it's champagne. And not only is it champagne, it's Moet de Chandon. So they're guzzling French champagne on the Eastern Front in the winter, which gives you insights into the way that alcohol is being used, but also the way in which the regime is transporting literally thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of bottles of alcohol from the captured territories to the East, to the men there. Here we see another picture of a similar type celebration, and you see the magnums again of champagne. Now, in kind of wrapping up, before we get to questions, for me, what was interesting about this topic was I think alcohol has been a topic that's been hiding in plain sight. And once you start looking for it, it's not a needle in a haystack anymore. You really start to find it in so many descriptions, in testimony of witnesses, perpetrators, and bystanders, and those who witness these acts. The other thing that was clear is that this idea of shared identity and creation of group identity and mission is part of the drinking rituals that occur in these killing units. And it's extremely important to note that alcohol was neither necessary nor sufficient for killing. In other words, the Holocaust happens regardless of if there's alcohol or not. But the way in which alcohol, song, celebratory ritual is incorporated into these actions is what gives us insights into the perpetrator mindset. And I have the bullet that talks about psychosomatic versus physiological effects of alcohol use. I like to talk about this one because it shows sometimes that we as historians, I think, have our own blind spots. Some of the most proficient killers, Friedrich Jeckeln, von den Bach, Zalewski, and Karl Jaeger of Einsatzkommando 3, in some cases, you see that it's talked about that they have trouble sleeping and they have intestinal problems. And what's often been used to explain that is that, in fact, what they're having a psychosomatic reaction to their participation in this murder. However, if you look at the physiological effects of very excessive alcohol use, one of the things you see, difficulty sleeping, stomach ulcers, intestinal problems. So I'm not saying that it's not necessarily right, but what I'm saying is, just like in the case of coping, when we complicate this picture by looking at alcohol in other ways, it starts to give us different, potentially different ways to see what's happening. And this is a slide from an earlier book, and I like to end my presentation with this slide because I can talk about masculinity, performative masculinity, theories of perpetration, and that can be very academic. But this is a picture of a young woman, and you see the little boy, and I don't know the relationship. What's happening at this moment is this is a security service, an SD interrogator, and he's questioning her in the forest somewhere. And the gentlemen that are standing up in the background or kneeling down are policemen. And I don't know what happened to her and this little boy. I know it was part of a collection of partisans that's held by the Bundesarchiv. And what I do know, however, is that in thousands and tens of thousands of cases, those found in the forest without papers, without a reason to be there, that this could in fact be that final moment that we get to see this young woman in that little boy before they're murdered. And I think that that's the human face that a lot of times when we do our academic, that we want to try to keep in mind. So I appreciate all your attention. And I'll go ahead and stop my share, and I look forward to any questions that you might have.
Thank you so much. That was so fascinating. I'm going to sort of use my position here to ask the first question, if I may. You mentioned this is a topic that's hiding in plain sight, and I wonder if it's a topic that you really came across in your prior books, and that's what sort of oriented you to the topic. And you've talked a little bit about the sources. So as a historian, I am curious about where you're turning to find information. And one last question, this must be really difficult material to deal with. So I wonder if you can even talk about how you sort of managed to cope with this kind of material.
Yeah, I think to start with the last question first, Kara, is I think we all as historians, especially of the Holocaust, this is probably some of the most egregious, horrific behavior in a very horrific chapter of history that I'm talking about. I think we try to compartmentalize some of our discussion of this to not, to keep our sanity. But one of the things that's always struck me in talking to survivors, and Zev Weiss, who has unfortunately passed a couple of years ago, was the president of the Holocaust Educational Foundation and a friend of mine. And he would mention that you historians, if anybody said you need to understand, any historian used the term understand, what he would immediately say is you all can't understand. He said, you can't understand what it was like because you weren't there. And I immediately knew that he was right about that. But what was clear to me when I'm doing research on a topic like this is part of the reason that we can't understand is because some of the things I'm describing is really beyond our comprehension. And then when you start to see this type of behavior, this is where you really start to get an idea for what it was like, what lived experience looked like for these individuals in the camps and in the East. With respect to where the idea came from, actually, it was giving my students different books. So Wendy Lauer's book, Hitler's Furies, The Holocaust by Bullets by Father Dubois, and Chris's book, obviously. And as I changed out those books over the course of a couple semesters, I started just hitting on alcohol and thinking more about it. And so the idea grew from actually my classroom teaching and what I was sharing with my students and some of their insights. With respect to sources, this is where going to the Holocaust Museum and having the opportunity to go through case files, these investigations of the perpetrators, which are German records, but then you start looking at witness memoirs or survivor memoirs. You start looking at bystander testimony, and you start looking at those who weren't direct perpetrators but were witnessing the actions, like that gentleman, that administrator that was going into the German house. And so what really was interesting about this is that I could start to really assimilate and find a number of these types of sources that dealt with this topic. And the other thing that was important for me to do was, as a historian, what was really clear to me was that when we talk about alcohol use, sociology, criminology, and psychology, those fields of the social sciences really have a number of great insights to share about how alcohol is used. For example, alcohol among gang members, how masculinity is incorporated in that. Peggy Sanders Reeves' work on university fraternities, for example, looking at alcohol and sexual violence and the way in which the perpetrators bond over that. And who can drink more, who can hold their liquor. So what you started, at least what I was starting to see, is that the social sciences really offered some really great insights into framing some of these behaviors that I was witnessing. And that was, I think, probably one of the most gratifying parts of the intellectual part of the research, was being able to draw on that literature.
Thank you so much. I'm always interested as a historian to hear about other historians' process. I just want to remind people that you can submit questions through the Q&A button, not through the chat. So there was a question earlier that's a little bit more contemporary, but the question was, are we seeing hypermasculinity in the US today? So what kind of, yeah, I'll leave.
Yeah, what I see, if we use the term, and the popularized term toxic masculinity has been out there, but the way in which, for example, masculinity is defined in Germany in the 1940s, what I described, actually, if we'd have gone to a New York bar in the 1930s and 1940s. Pete Hamill, who's a writer who wrote a book, a newspaper writer, but he also wrote several books, including A Drinking Life. And he remembers those working class bars in New York. And he talks about how that they were largely male only spaces. If women were allowed in, they were put in the back room, and they were quote, kind of questionable morals. But what happened in that front room is your ability to drink and hold your liquor, and your ability to use your fists kind of determined your rank order amongst these men. And I think that we see some of that same dynamic in terms of when we look at sports teams, when we look at fraternities. We see the ways in which alcohol and camaraderie can be a very positive thing. It can create that sense of team building, if you will, but it can also be very much a negative that we see in these cases. And this is what I think there's a line there where I think it's important for people to kind of understand the flip side of some of these positive behaviors when taken to the extreme, then kind of show us the other side of that. So for me, that was part of looking at this at the subject and thinking about it. And I was a pilot in the Air Force at one time, and at that time it was a male only kind of combat arms kind of environment. And in the bar, the idea of being able to drink and hold your liquor, to play these drinking games or get involved in them, was very much one of the ways in which you performed against your fellow men in that case. So some of this I've seen in my own experience, and I think that that's where my lived experience in some cases helps to inform the way I see these group dynamics as well.
Thank you. So we have another question from one of my colleagues, Benita Blessing. She asks, could you share how students react to this material when you teach it? You've talked about discussing how you contextualize young people in alcohol use when you teach this material, for instance.
Yeah, thanks, Anita. And I obviously know your work very well. So it's great that you took time to be here. Students, what I find, are very interested in this topic. So when I started developing this idea, students respond to it because it is part of their lived experience at a certain level, not necessarily the atrocity part, but certainly the drinking and how drinking is used. And one could argue, if you've been looking at the Chronicle, Norwich University is now involved in a hazing incident, which was the female rugby team was using alcohol and hazing against members. So there's this lawsuit. We see this kind of behavior that I think that students can certainly they can identify with this from their own experience at some level, and I think it reaches them in that way, which is really kind of important for me for them to see that this is not just an academic subject. That in fact there are applications. What we've seen in the Ukraine, for example, the stories coming out of Bucha, the idea of alcohol, torture chambers, sexual violence on the part of perpetrators. Again, I think we start to see the ways in which the integration of some of these activities are important. And one of the things that I would mention that's a really important point is there were men who talked about not wanting to drink. And so Karl Kretschmer, who's a member of the Einsatz group, and is writing back to his family, and he reminds his wife in one of his letters, he says, it's the end of the day, but we're going to be playing cards and drinking afterwards. And he said, you can't afford not to be there. And what was really interesting about it was the fact that these men, if they didn't drink, it wasn't the fact that you were saying you didn't want to drink tonight. The way it was interpreted by the group was not only you don't want to drink with them, but that you're also rejecting the group's activities for that day. So the way in which this kind of camaraderie and peer pressure also is used to integrate these acts. And it's not just in the Holocaust that I've seen this dynamic. For example, in the book, I talk a little bit about what happens in Rwanda. And there are some very striking similarities to these same types of rituals amongst the killers, post-killing celebration in cabarets, barbecues, group barbecues, the distribution of plunder amongst the killers and their wives after the killing. So I think that there's more to this topic than just thinking in terms of Nazi Germany. And that's one of the things that I'm really interested in seeing. We know that alcohol and sexual violence in the Balkans was another area where we see that physical and sexual violence. So looking at the way in which the perpetrators used alcohol in those cases is also another case that I think deserves more attention in its own right.
Thank you. I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit more about the regime's definition of masculinity, particularly the alcohol use. I mean, it's quite interesting. You started with the SA, and then you've mentioned the SS, Gestapo, the police battalion. So it seems to be widespread in Wehrmacht. But I mean, like the man who comes to the woman wearing uniforms covered in blood and brains. I mean, if you could talk a little bit more about the regime's notion of masculinity and whether alcohol was always going to be part of that, or whether it's an evolution that takes place in the context of war.
Yeah, well, one of the paradoxes are these tragic ironies, if you will, of the Third Reich, and it's a regime riven with paradoxes. Is this idea that at the same time that this behavior is going on, there are two things. Himmler, the way he describes how he wants these parties to look like, is he wants them to be where the policemen come back. They have one or two beers, so a half liter, a liter of beer max. They sing songs, they read poetry, and they have this kind of camaraderie. That's his vision of what it should look like. And in fact, what we see is something different. And there's a case where I talk about in the book, a Polish waitress who works in a restaurant. She remembers how several times a week this SS unit would come back from the killing fields, and she recalls how they would sing and drink and eat. And she also recalls how they would have chariot races. They push each other around in their chairs, around the tables. And then she recalls how she had to fend off their sexual advances too, in this case. And so we see this disconnect, right? We see this disconnect with this idea, for example, that Himmler is propagating, and the actions on the ground. And at the same time, in Germany, there's the whole idea of the Getränkefrage, which is the drinking question, where Robert Proctor and others have talked about, where the Nazis recognize that alcohol and tobacco use have negative health effects. And so there's this idea of, well, we're going to try to get the society to drink and smoke less, and that doesn't prove very successful. However, what we do see is this idea of gender roles, where the quote good German girl in the BDM neither smokes nor drinks, right? That's the ideal type, if you will. The way in which these gender roles are kind of transformed, this what I talked about, hypermasculinity that incorporates two things in my mind: this idea of militarized masculinity, which is toughness, willing to fight, that the regime incorporates, but also the strict gender roles and the racialized nature of Nazi ideas for men with respect to procreation, with respect to what it means to be a man. I think these all come together to form a certain ideal type that doesn't necessarily mean it's hegemonic. It doesn't necessarily mean that all men, adopt it. But what I think we see is that it becomes the ideal type that many strive for, at least becomes the marker for this kind of, if you will, masculine toughness or masculinity.
Thank you. I have so many more follow-up questions I could ask, but I'm going to move to one from the audience. A recent book published in English is Blitzed by Oler. I forget his first
Yeah,
name.
Norman Oler. Yeah.
He talks about the use of methamphetamines by the Nazis. And do you find overlap with alcohol? Do you find discussion of methamphetamines in the materials you're
Yeah,
looking at?
yeah, that's a great question, and I get asked this. And what's really interesting to me, that Oler's book, Pervitin, Panzerschokolade, or methamphetamine, that is used by, for example, tank crews and air crews to stay awake, soldiers to stay awake in these campaigns in France or in Russia, that Oler kind of, in my mind, tends to create causality. So the idea, and that's been one of the criticisms of the book by Dagmar Herzog, Richard Evans, and others, is that he tends to say, well, this is causality. This is why they become involved, because they're hyped up on meth. And that's why I really underline this idea that alcohol was neither necessary nor sufficient. Holocaust happens without it. The other thing that is striking to me when looking at Pervitin or methamphetamine, Heinrich Himmler writes memos about everything, about venereal disease, marriage, marriage applications. He is so focused on paperwork. But in having looked at tens of thousands of pages of his correspondence, I find a lot of discussion where he's telling police not to be drinking on duty, or issuing orders about how he's had another example of policemen getting drunk and using their weapons against each other, which is crossing the line, because now it's your comrade that you're threatening with this. But I find this discussion of alcohol in a lot of his correspondence. I have yet to find him make a mention of Pervitin use within the police or the SS. And so that's the Sherlock Holmes dog that didn't bark. The fact that it's not there doesn't mean that there might be something that he says about it. But the fact that in looking at all this correspondence by a guy who really spends a lot of times in the weeds, that he doesn't mention it, I think is really significant. So that to me is a huge differentiation between looking at this idea of illicit drugs or meth in this case and alcohol and the way that they're used differently, I would say.
Thank you. Oh, we have another question from the audience. As you were describing these rituals, I started thinking of the behavior of gangs and drug and alcohol use. I'm also seeing this as a behavior of militia groups such as Proud Boys and Oath Keepers. Has there been research into ritual and alcohol in these groups?
Yeah, again, another great question. And where I've seen, for example, in some of the criminology literature, it looks at youth gangs and how violence in these initiation rituals are used, and the integration of acts of either intoxicants like alcohol and or illicit drugs, how they're used in these gangs is to kind of create camaraderie, to also promote violence. That's definitely something that I borrowed from. Some of that literature is definitely there, and I think that there are some points when we look at the stormtroopers, especially, and Sven Reichart's book kind of looks at them as kind of a kind of gang, if you will. He uses that term, and I think that that's one way that we can, in fact, see them. So I do think that that parallel is a good one, and it's something that I explore in the book, and I think it's worthy of additional exploration.
Thank you. I'm again going to ask a historical research question. I'm wondering, I think you mentioned that some of the sources you used are going to be court records. Forgive me if I missed that. I wonder if it benefited someone who was on trial to mention the use of alcohol or if it was problematic for them.
Yeah, again, a really good question because in the East, under German law during the Nazi regime, Volltrunkenheit, so being completely intoxicated, is seen as a mitigating factor in acts that would otherwise be illegal. That can include things like sexual violence. It can include male-on-male sexual violence. For example, SS courts look at this as one thing. So, but after the war, it's still seen as potentially mitigating. So when you have people talking, policemen describing in testimony when they're being interrogated, oh yeah, we were all drunk, or yeah, they were all drunk. You see policemen using, when they're put at the spot of a massacre or a killing, they're using alcohol as an alibi or as a potential alibi to essentially then excuse their behavior. And if it were to come to court, then again, this idea of alcohol being that mitigating factor could be brought in. And so this is where I think this is also where the coping, that coping kind of mechanism and this kind of historical, if you look at most of the historiography about alcohol, it cites coping. And it's also exactly what the perpetrators themselves use in many cases. But then when you start to see some of the evidence that I'm showing you, right, we're seeing actions that are in no way coping with alcohol use. And so I think it became, for some of the perpetrators, a way to at least try to deny their responsibility or at least mitigate their guilt within the legal system.
And I'm going to ask a follow-up. I'm going to really exploit my privilege here. Your comment there about the psychosomatic versus the physiological effects of alcohol was really interesting to me. And I wonder if historians have maybe been misreading the use of alcohol as a, as a people using it to cope, and that, maybe there's a physical response to what they're going through. And so you've mentioned that you're reading also in other fields. And I don't know if do you feel like there's sort of a course correction we might want to do if we think about the physiological effects of alcohol use?
Yeah, I mean, I think that that's one of the things that I think is really out there, that there are multi-functions of alcohol, and the fact that a perpetrator can use alcohol to facilitate and maybe at some time coping for some of the perpetrators. It definitely is a coping mechanism. I don't discount that. But that use of alcohol can change over time and at different times, I think. And to me, this is where I think that we as normal non-Nazis, uh, we look for an explanation that's more comfortable to us. Of course, the only way that you could be involved in actions like that would be to have to drink yourself into a stupor. And then that allows us to have an explanation that makes sense to us. But then when we start to see the idea of eating and drinking and music and this incorporation, now it really complicates that explanation. And that's what I think that's really the major in my mind, the major impact or benefit of the book itself is to really complicate that look. And for those of us who do perpetrator motivation, we can never look inside somebody's head, but we can watch their behaviors and their actions, and we can look at the words, the linguistic structures that they use, and the linguistics that others use to describe their actions. And I think that that gives us, again, not only behavior, but the words, the way others are interpreting their actions, really gives us some insights into this area as well.
Thank you. We have another audience question. Was there any mention of alcohol use in the testimony at Nuremberg?
Yeah, Hajmar Schacht actually talks about alcohol. And so Schacht was the head of the bank, the German bank economic minister. And in one of his utterances, he said, the only, really most people in the Third Reich, he said, were good people. He said, however, they were kind of led astray, if you will, by Hitler and the fanatics. And the way in which they dealt with this, and this is what Schock says, is by drinking alcohol or taking narcotics. So he does make that, he does use the term narcotics in there. And that's the only way that good people could become involved in the system, right? That's how they became complicit by taking alcohol and drugs. And as I talked about before, I kind of parse that out a little bit more. And he's in the dock, right? And so they're all looking for ways to essentially say, yeah, there was really, we were good people. It was just, Hitler and the head Nazis, Hitler and Himmler, and drugs and alcohol that made us do these terrible things.
Thank you. I'm going to keep giving you questions. Someone asked, is there evidence of alcohol use, ritual, and other characteristics of camaraderie taking place during the genocide of Native Americans?
Yeah, that's a really good question as well. And where you see that, and I have one of my colleagues who's doing a book on Indian scalp taking, so scalp taking and scalp bounties, where you see the use of alcohol sometimes in the borderlands of the Southwest, for example, is traders, these normal traders giving Apache or Comanche or different tribal groups alcohol to get them drunk and then incapacitate them in order then to take their scalps for the scalp bounties, for example. So you do see the way in which alcohol is used as an instrument to incapacitate Native American tribes, where you also see the intersection of alcohol and violence. These mining communities, for example, in the Rocky Mountains, this drinking culture that's part of that. You see the way in which alcohol and violence, including sexual violence against Native women, for example, is integrated into some of these stories, and in fact, into some of these incidences that become larger incidences that kind of blow up, if you will, into punitive raids and raid retribution. And I don't want to go too far off on this, but I think also that the murdered and missing women and girls, the study that came out of Canada, the First Nations, looks at also the way in which alcohol and sexual violence, some of that, the connection between those as well. And that comes into a contemporary as as well. So that's not just looking at, for example, the US West in the 19th century. We see that extended into the 20th and 21st century as well.
Thank you. I'm going to again ask a question. Um, I'm wondering if you're seeing age impacting alcohol use at all, as younger recruits come in, or because I know the regime in some ways tried to limit teenage consumption of alcohol.
Yeah, well, what's interesting about that is since the East, the zone of exception, alcohol in the East is a luxury good. And it gets used, as I kind of mentioned at the end, uh, schnapps and champagne and red wine and Bavarian beer are shipped into these areas to support these paramilitary groups, SS and police, to support the Wehrmacht. And there's also the issue of that in many places water sources aren't very good, so alcohol is used in place of that. And for those who are familiar with colonial America, the colonial US, that's also a case where, you have people starting the day drinking hard cider, not water from the well, because the hard cider's, is good. The water's not going to be good. And so we see there's a dynamic there, but the idea that supplying these men with this is interesting. And then when I see orders, for example, in Minsk, I believe, there's an order that has to be issued every week to the policemen there. Don't drink on duty. And it says, repeat this order every week. And you see also these kinds of orders in Auschwitz as well amongst the SS guards. And the only reason you're having to repeat an order every week or over and over is because individuals are ignoring the order, right? They're doing it anyway. And so this is where we kind of see how the East is also a zone of exception with respect to that drinking. And one of the chapters that I look at is how drinking and culture intersects. And I talk about ethnic auxiliaries, so Latvian, Lithuanian, Ukrainian, SS and police auxiliaries and their use. And we see many of the very same behaviors that are used by these ethnic auxiliaries, especially in actions and mass murder of Jews. And one of the ways that I found, I'll share this with the group, was the integration of music in this case, that you would see Latvian or Lithuanian or Ukrainian killing groups come back from these murders. Now they're under German command, but in many cases you have people remembering they were singing the Latvian national anthem or the Ukrainian national song. And so what was really striking about for me about that is they're coming back singing that, and it's a symbolic denaturalization of the Jews that they just killed, right? They don't belong to this national community. So we're actually using song after, in the wake of these killings, to denaturalize Lithuanian Jews or Ukrainian Jews. And that was really a striking thing. So some of the behaviors that I talk about with respect to the SS and police, definitely see them with respect to these auxiliaries and the Wehrmacht as well, the German army.
Fascinating. Thank you. There's another question in the chat or in the Q&A. And again, if you would like to post a question, please use the Q&A button. And this, I don't know if you think you can answer it, but do you believe the use of alcohol is a response to masculine fragility?
Yeah, that's a tough question, because what we see is we see that it doesn't necessarily need to be used by men alone. It's the ideal under Nazi Germany. But I'll give you an example of in the camps. There's a beating going on, and it's an SS man flogging a woman, and one of the female SS guards takes the whip away from him and says, "You're not doing it right," to the SS man. And she begins to beat this woman. And when I read that, what was so striking to me about that is that she is appropriating the male masculine standard to then administer this punishment, and showing herself as tougher than this guy that was doing it. And it's not, so she's not using the gender norm that she has, she's appropriating the male gender norm. And Wendy Lauer's book, Hitler's Furies, talks about Erna Petrie. She kills these Jewish children. And when she's being interrogated by the East German police after the war, much later, she said, I didn't want to stand, her husband's an SS officer. She said, I didn't want to stand behind the men. I wanted to show that I could do this as well. So this kind of corrupting idea of, it can kind of cross, if you will, gender lines, which really makes it interesting. And I wonder, I do wonder if I'm looking at those SA pubs, the fact that women aren't allowed to go into those sites in green is really telling. And the idea that alcohol, just like the use of a pistol, for example, by camp guards, is reserved for men. Now, there are, as Elisa Mylander's work has shown, at Majdanek, for example, female camp guards have pistols. At Auschwitz, they have pistols, but they don't use them to shoot. They use them to pistol whip or beat the women. And so the idea that they're able to have the weapon in this zone of exception in the East, but even the way that it's prescribed to how they can use it, right? So I think that these are the kinds of, these are the kinds of questions and the kinds of information and evidence that really kind of let us dig into these perceptions. And I do think that this hypermasculine culture, the way it's built, this racialized performative masculinity, I talked about militarized as well, that it has a corrupting influence. And I think that we see that in other areas and other places. Rugby teams tend to be, if I'm hard drinking, hard playing kind of culture as well. You see that the way it's incorporated. But as I've talked about, it's nowadays, it's just not men. It can be women that are involved in that kind of behavior as well. So I think it just kind of crosses over into those into other issues.
It's so interesting. You talk about this zone of exemption in the East. And I was thinking also of Lisa Mylander's book too, and her work on female guards. So there really is no evidence of female guards drinking as well. Like they don't have access to the
they do in the East. So this is the key thing, right? So when I'm talking about the SA pubs, right, those are women in Germany proper. But when we get into the camps, this is when, in fact, we do see female guards being involved in drinking and also pretty profligate sexual activity in some cases. And Gabrielle Haut, who just finished her dissertation at Clark, talks about Robin's book, and she shared a document with me in which that SS canteen, there's a description of one of the prisoners who's a server in the SS canteen, and she's watching as there's an orgy going on the tables between the SS men and SS female guards in the canteen itself. And so that's where the East is a zone of exception, but concentration camps themselves are also a zone of exception. There are places where the normal rules don't apply, where you are able to take advantage of kind of lifting these rules or these kind of prohibitions, if you will.
Thank you. Again, fascinating. There was a question. It deals a little bit with whether alcohol is used to process trauma. And I wonder if you want to talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I do think it is. That's kind of the coping. Mechanism, and there are those who use it as coping. What's also kind of difficult to disentangle about some of these perpetrators, especially those who've been in the East for a number of years, is once you become a heavy drinker like that, the question is, how is that alcohol, kind of the physiological need for alcohol as well. But I also remind my students, and some of the viewers may be familiar with Mad Men. This advertising firm that if you watch that show, It's the 1950s. It's after the Korean War. And these guys are going into Fifth Avenue into their office. And in the morning, they're having a meeting and they're drinking, and they're sitting down with a highball or sitting down with a glass of scotch. They're going to lunch and having martinis. And then in the afternoon, at the afternoon meeting, they're drinking again, another bourbon or scotch. And when we see that show, at least our initial reaction probably is that's a bunch of alcoholics. But what we don't necessarily realize is the social construction of alcohol use and acceptable alcohol use has changed dramatically in the time, in the time since the 1950s and 2020. And that I think is an important kind of caution when we think about if alcohol can be used in those settings, and it was used in those settings in that way, that the two martini lunch becomes kind of a trope because it's a fact that becomes that was a reality. Now it changes over time, but I think again that we have to think about situating alcohol use and the way it's used in the time period that we see. And the other thing I'll mention is that for Germans, the idea of drinking beer, it's not really seen as alcohol. What I mean by that, there's an expression that beer in Germany is liquid bread. So it's not a luxury item. It's considered to be just a food stuff in that way. And now it gets watered down over the course of the year. People complain about the quality of beer in Germany proper during the war. But again, it's a different way of thinking about drinking beer. It's not really drinking alcohol and how it's then used, right? That kind of celebration, camaraderie, the integration of it into those functions where you're not really drinking to get drunk, you're drinking for that effect. And Rosenberg, the ideologue of the Nazi Party, writes an article complaining about this German view in the 1920s that the best guy is the guy that can drink the other guy under the Biertisch or the Bierstube, the idea that if I can outdrink you, that I'm a better man. So again, we see these kinds of ideas. He's against that idea, but it shows that the idea that that's an idea that's prevalent.
Do you have the sense as you read these materials if the East is this zone of exception exception, that the concept or the idea is that when men return back to Germany, the Alt-Reich, that somehow these behaviors will change?
Yeah, and that's the question that I'm really interested in, because I think what would be really interesting, this is a topic that really needs to be looked at, domestic violence in the Third Reich. And what I'm interested with that, Vandana Yoshi has done some work that's related to this, but I'm interested in if we could get those sources and see how these men behave with their spouses, for example, with their wives and their girlfriends, and then if we could push that study after 1945 into the Bundesrepublik and look at are these behaviors, is domestic violence per se and alcohol use and sexual violence, how do we see it in German society after the war? Are these men acculturated to certain types of actions that they continue even in the post-war period? So to me, that's a fascinating topic to think about, because I think it could give us some really interesting insights. One of the things that I've seen in looking at the police is it's not normally the man who turns himself in, the policeman who says, I can't live with what I did in the East, I'm going to go down to the police station and turn myself in for killings that I participated in. It's actually what you see often, and I have a couple examples of this in my earlier. It's the spouse who's being abused by the husband, who finally goes to the police and makes a complaint and says, oh, by the way, let me tell you what he and his buddies talk about when they're drinking at the house and the stories they tell. And in some cases, that's what actually starts to lead to an investigation of some of these police units. It's this spouse who can't take it anymore and uses that and shares that information. So I think there's something that would be really fascinating to take that topic and move with it. The sourcing of that topic is the one thing that I'm just not sure about. I'm not sure how you get to that, and you get to those stories. So that's something I'm still kind of wrestling with.
There was another question. Have you seen the film Come and See?
Yeah, so yeah, that is that's kind of a hardcore, if you will. That's one of those non-redemptive, in your face. The idea of Einsatzgruppen are the killers and how they're involved in killing, and I think it does from some of the stories that I've told tonight that you've heard. I think you can see it in some of those actions. In other words, if you watch that film and then you listen to this presentation, you would in fact see some of those behaviors. It's a very difficult film to watch, though, because of the horrific nature of the violence that's included in it. But again, I think it does give us some insights into these kinds of behaviors that I've talked about.
Um, well, I'm wondering, you've taken some of this research into other parts of Europe. I know you've presented, for example, in Kiev, Paris. Sorry, that's my dog. I'm curious about reception. Have you talked yet in Germany about this topic? Have you taken it to, if I may
Yeah,
ask?
so I've been to a number of places. The 80th anniversary or commemoration of the Babin Yar massacre. I presented there, and that was virtually. I was the only virtual presenter, and I've done talks in London. I've done talks in Sydney at the Jewish Museum there, Paris, Yahad. What's also interesting about Yahad is Yahad in Unum, which some of your viewers may be familiar with, Father Patrick Dubois and the taking of testimony, and now he's doing that actually in Ukraine as we speak to get testimonies about what's happened in this current war. But he's also done it with the Yazidis as well, and looked at testimony about what happened to these cities. But in the case of presenting Yahad, their testimonies, what's really interesting is over 300 of their videotape testimonies. The witnesses recall alcohol and the use of alcohol, the integration on the part of the perpetrators. So it's one of those things. In talking with some of the folks that have worked there as I was doing the book, this was definitely a topic that they said, yeah, that really is something that we see also in the field. Now, with respect to Germany proper, yeah, I'm still waiting to see what the reception can be. I did get contacted by a reporter at the Bild Zeitung, so this Boulevard Daily, several weeks ago, and he was interested potentially in doing a story on the book, but I hadn't heard anything back on that. What I can tell you is that the Süddeutsche Zeitung actually on Friday did a short article on alcohol and war. So I think that what we're seeing here is there's definitely interest. There's definitely interest in this topic.
So I'm going to finish with one difficult question, if I
Oh,
may. There are these questions in German history about how comparable the Holocaust is and the fears of relativism if you compare, but you've talked about alcohol here being used by German troops, auxiliary troops, and in other circumstances. And so I wonder if you want to, if your focus on alcohol has made you think of that question at all, or if it raises any complications about the comparability of this genocide.
yeah, having done a book on Hitler's Ostkrieg or Eastern War in the American West, I do think that when we think about genocide, that comparative work really gives us insights. And what I like about comparative work that I would not have guessed is if you start looking at the U.S. West in the 19th century, you're looking at ethnographical studies, you're looking at Native American studies, you're looking at borderland studies, you're looking at a number of kind of literature areas, if you will, scholarship, all their own. But in doing that, what I found was that in looking at that literature, it made me ask different questions about my own field. And that's where I really saw the value, the insights that I got from looking at that literature. And I'll share one with you, and this is probably a good one to end it on, is the loss of spiritual communities. For example, through the loss of language, the prevention of use of language among Native American communities, through the loss of the bison, which is this cosmological and not only a food source for Native communities. But when I was looking at that and looking at so-called Yiddishland, Lithuanian Poland, these areas that were the center of Jewish learning before the Holocaust, and where Yiddish is almost wiped out in these areas, and where these communities and this spiritual center of Judaism uh, uh, is also, this learning is wiped out in many cases and destroyed. And to think about what it means to lose that spiritual community and what was lost for Judaism, and then to look at that same process in the US West on the plains, and to think what was lost in the same way in Native American communities. I really think that those are some of the insights, that it's not so much about saying one is exactly like the other. It's explaining how they're alike and how they're different, and what that tells us, and how looking at the other one allows us to see new things about our own field.
Thank you. What I've enjoyed so much about your work is not only this comparison, but also how you branch into other fields and use other fields to inform how you're looking at what you're seeing. And I think that's really helpful. Well, thank you so much for a wonderful talk and for answering all of our questions tonight. Thank you to all who attended this evening. And I'm going to once again encourage you to click on the link in the chat and find the website for our Holocaust Memorial Week page. And there you can find the poster for other events. And there are wonderful events scheduled all through the week and also carrying on into next week. So with that, I'm going to say thank you very much to Dr. Edward Westerman. Thank you again so much for staying up late with us and for doing this wonderful talk. And I look forward to seeing other people at other events this week. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Kara. And thanks to everybody for being here. Have a great evening, and I appreciate the invitation.
Thank you.